After you've set up the materials and lighting to work with Mental Ray, it's time to start doing some test renders. Go to the Render Scene dialog. I recommend that you begin with a preset. There are many presets that come with the program relevant to Mental Ray. Select Mental Ray Daylighting Draft to do some test renders. These are different categories of presets. Some of them are in the Environment dialog, while others are on different tabs of the Render Scene dialog. Load them all. Then go to the Indirect Illumination tab right here. There are three forms of indirect illumination in Mental Ray. Final Gather is one of them. Turn this feature off. It was turned on by the preset, and I don't want to get ahead of myself. Caustics and Global Illumination, or GI as it's known, are the other two forms of indirect illumination, and both of these features are off right now. Now let's do a test render. What we see is going to be all direct illumination. And when I click render, you're going to see the rendered frame window appear. Watch closely because it's going to happen fast. The rendering is going to proceed differently than you've ever seen before. Do you see that bracket moving around in a seemingly random pattern? Each bracket contains what is called a bucket, and each bucket can be rendered separately in a different thread. And this is one of the reasons why Mental Ray is scalable and it can be very efficient. It's because each bucket can be handed to a different processor. These can be on your local machine or on a LAN. It's possible, if you're technically minded, to set up a distributed bucket render on your local area network, or you can even hire a commercial render farm to process your rendering very rapidly with many processors. Now back to this rendering. We're seeing the direct illumination only right now, and it's clearly very dark. That's because the light is coming out of the sun, going through the windows, and striking the floor. End of story. So indirect illumination is super important for making this scene look realistic. Let's go back here, open this rollout, and enable GI. Just leave all the settings at their default. Do a test render. Now it's starting to look a little bit more realistic because we're starting to see some light intensity in the rest of the building. But it's too dark overall. Go to the Environment dialog and observe that Logarithmic exposure control has been activated. This was activated by the preset. However, the exterior daylight flag is checked. And in this situation, we're in an interior, so we need to uncheck this option. Do another test render, and it will be much brighter. In fact, it's too bright. Turn down the brightness from 65 to 50. Notice that the render preview doesn't work here. Even though it has a progress bar and it goes through the process, it just gives you a black image. So the only way to adjust brightness is to do test renders. I'll render again with a brightness of 50, and that looks acceptable. So I can close the Environment dialog. Now what are we looking at here? This is GI. You saw what it looked like with direct illumination. So this is obviously a dramatic improvement. However, we see lots of circles on the wall. These are photons. To understand this, let's change the maximum number of photons per sample from 500 down to 1, and render again. So we're seeing far fewer photons here. We're able to make out the individual photons. It looks like a paintball war has occurred in this room. This should give you some insight into what is actually happening here. The photons come through the windows and they bounce off the floor, they bounce off the ceiling, they bounce around on the walls, and eventually they're going to splatter on a wall. This happens down here with the trace depth. We have it set so that there's a maximum depth of 5 reflections or refractions. So those photons are going to bounce 5 times, and then they're going to splatter on the wall. The reason that we're doing this is because the photons carry the color of each surface that they hit with them, and they ultimately splatter that color on the final bounce. In this case, after 5 reflections or refractions. If we increase this number, let's say to 10, then we can increase the maximum number of reflections, say to 10. I'll leave the refractions at 5. Render again. More bouncing means more color is being spread around. Maybe it looks a little better, but still, it looks pretty awful because we're only dealing with 1 photon per sample. I'm going to set this back to 500, which was the default, and render again. So we have more bouncing, more spreading of color. It looks incrementally better than it did before. However, this isn't the end of the story. In fact, it's only the beginning.